All right, everyone, get ready for today's deep dive. We're going to be exploring the world of 2D perovskites for solar cells. And we've got this awesome review paper by researcher Xiao to help guide us through it. It's like our roadmap to understanding this cutting-edge area of research.
Oh, yeah. Xiao Zhang's review is a really great pick. I mean, it covers pretty much the whole landscape, from the basic fundamentals to the latest and greatest breakthroughs in 2D and quasi-2D perovskites.
Now, I'm trying to remember from some of our past deep dives, it seems like perovskites have been making a pretty big splash in the solar energy world, right? But why are we seeing this shift to 2D perovskites now? What's the issue with the 3D ones?
Well, think of it this way. 3D perovskites are really good at their job, like amazingly good at converting sunlight to electricity. But they're also kind of like, those fancy delicate pastries? They taste incredible, but they fall apart if you just look at them wrong.
Oh, I see what you mean. So they're really sensitive then.
Super sensitive to moisture, oxygen, heat. You name it, it probably messes with them.
So they're kind of like the divas of the solar world. All that potential, but with a whole bunch of demands.
Haha, yeah, that's a great way to put it. And that's where these 2D perovskites step onto the stage. By adding these large organic cations, or spacers, between the layers of the perovskite structure, we basically give it a suit of armor, a protective barrier.
So it's like we're taking that fragile pastry and encasing it in like bulletproof glass.
Exactly. That's a perfect analogy. These spacers make the perovskite way more stable and robust. They can handle a lot more.
But I mean, adding those spacers, it can't be all sunshine and roses, right?
Right.
Does it affect how well the material converts sunlight to electricity? Like the overall efficiency?
You're totally on the right track. Adding those spacers does have an impact. It changes the way electrons move through the material, what we call charge carrier transport. It becomes kind of direction dependent, what scientists call anisotropic. It's a trade-off, right? You gain stability, but you might sacrifice a little bit of that oomph in terms of converting sunlight to energy.
So it's like we're putting some speed bumps on that electron highway. Okay, I get it.
Hmm.
But what I find really interesting is how many different kinds of these 2D perovskites there are. This paper mentions a whole bunch of different types. Can we break that down a bit? What makes them different?
Oh, for sure. It can get kind of complicated. The general formula for 2D perovskites, it's a bit more complex than that simple ABX3 we see with 3D perovskites. It looks something like LMAN1BNX3N plus 1, at least for the Redelson-Popper and Dion-Jacobson types. And then there's the alternating cation in the interlayer types, which look like LAMBNX3N plus 1.
Okay, whoa. Let's maybe not get too lost in all those letters and numbers.
You got it. I get a little carried away sometimes. The main thing to remember is the L represents that organic spacer we've been talking about. That's the key player in creating those 2D layers. And then we have N, which tells us how many layers of the inorganic perovskite material are sandwiched between those spacers. So a smaller N means it's more like a pure 2D structure, and a larger N means it's closer to a 3D perovskite.
So it's kind of like a spectrum then, from pure 2D to quasi-2D to 3D. And those spacers are like the control knobs that dictate where you fall on that spectrum.
Exactly, you got it. And the type of spacer you use, it makes a huge difference in what that final material is like, what properties it has.
Okay, so let's dive into those spacers a bit more. What are some of the big names, the ones researchers are really excited about, and how do they decide which ones are best suited for a particular perovskite?
It's like they're holding auditions for the best perovskite bodyguard. And there are a few stars that have really emerged. For the Redelson-Popper types, butyl ammonium and phenylethyl ammonium are the early favorites. But scientists are always tinkering, tweaking those structures to find that sweet spot, the optimal length for that organic chain. If it's too short, it might not provide enough protection, but if it's too long, it might actually hinder how the perovskite performs.
So it's about finding that Goldilocks length for that spacer chain, huh? Not too short, not too long, just right. I'm guessing that Goldschmidt tolerance factor you mentioned earlier comes into play here too. What is that exactly, and why is it so important?
You're really sharp catching that. The Goldschmidt tolerance factor, well, it basically helps us figure out how stable a perovskite structure is going to be based on the size of the ions involved. It's like a compatibility check, if the ions are too different in size, the whole structure just won't be stable.
So it's like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole.
Exactly. It just won't work. And scientists use this factor as a rule of thumb when they're designing new spacers and perovskite materials.
Made sense. So it sounds like there's a whole bunch of different spacer options out there, each with their own set of pros and cons.
Yeah.
What are some of the other popular choices?
Let's see. For the Dion-Jacobson spacers, we have PDA and BDA. These guys create more rigid structures, held together by these strong hydrogen bonds, which on the one hand is great for stability, but on the other hand, it can sometimes make it tougher for those perovskite crystals to form correctly.
It's always about finding that balance,
Yeah,
right? Stability versus ease of fabrication.
you hit the nail on the head. And then we have the ACI type, which only uses guanidinium as a spacer. That one's kind of unique. It creates these really interesting structures where the layers are really close together, which, can have some interesting consequences for charge transport.
So there's a whole universe of these spacers out there, huh? Each one with its own, personality and its own impact on the perovskite material. I'm starting to see why researchers are so excited about exploring all these different possibilities.
Yes, I know, right? It's like a whole new world of materials just waiting to be discovered. And we haven't even talked about the really cutting edge stuff yet, where they're mixing and matching different spacers.
Oh, wow. Like a perovskite cocktail.
Yeah, exactly. Like they're trying to come up with the perfect perovskite recipe, by playing with these different molecular ingredients. But we also have to remember it's not just about the ingredients themselves, it's also about how you combine them, how you put them together. And that brings us to the really important part of actually fabricating these 2D perovskite thin films.
Okay, so we've got our perovskite stars and their spacer bodyguards all set. Now, how do we actually get them to form this nice, smooth film that can be used in a solar cell?
That's where things get really interesting. It's not just about, spreading the material out on a surface. It's about controlling how those crystals actually form and arrange themselves, a process we call crystallization.
So it's not like just slapping some paint on a canvas. It's more like crafting a masterpiece using these really precise brushstrokes.
Absolutely, you got it. And when we're talking about 2D perovskite thin films, there are certain properties, key characteristics that researchers are really focused on. One of the most important being crystal orientation. We want those perovskite layers to be stacked up nice and vertically, like columns in a building. That's crucial for efficient charge transport.
Oh, so like making sure all the lanes on our electron highway are all going in the right direction.
Exactly. You're getting it. And a bunch of things can influence this orientation, like the type of spacer you use, and heat value, even the way you fabricate the film.
Sounds like a pretty delicate balancing act to get it just right.
Right.
What else do researchers have to be careful about?
Another really important thing is what we call phase distribution. Remember how we were talking about that spectrum from pure 2D to quasi-2D to 3D? Well, within a single thin film, you can actually have different regions with different values. So it's like a gradient within the film.
Wait, so it's not a completely uniform structure throughout the whole film?
Nope. Not necessarily. Sometimes you get what's called a normal gradient distribution, which means you have more of those 3D-like perovskites near the top surface and more of the 2D-like perovskites near the bottom.
So it's kind of like a perovskite parfait, with different layers of 2D and 3D goodness. But why would you want that kind of gradient? I mean, what's the point?
Well, it turns out that having that specific arrangement, it can actually be really beneficial for something called charge extraction. Basically, it helps those electrons get out of the film and into the external circuit where they can actually do work. But researchers are also looking into other types of distributions, like reverse gradient, where the 3D part is at the bottom, and phase pure films, where the N value is basically the same throughout the entire film. Each one has its own advantages and disadvantages, of course.
Wow. So you've got this whole world of spacer options, and then on top of that, you've got all these different ways to arrange the perovskites within the film. It's mind-boggling.
It is, and that's really just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the complexities of making these 2D perovskite thin films. There's this whole other world of what we call precursor ink engineering and processing techniques that we haven't even touched on yet.
Okay, well, I guess we better dive into that fascinating world then. I'm ready to learn about all the, alchemy involved in creating these perovskite masterpieces.
Let's do it. Welcome back. So before we get into the nitty-gritty of how these 2D perovskite thin films are actually made, we kind of need to understand, the basics of how those teeny tiny crystals form in the first place.
Yeah, okay. Let's talk crystallization. I remember from some of our past deep dives that it's basically about those perovskite molecules, like finding each other and arranging themselves into that specific ordered structure.
You got it. It's a super delicate dance of chemistry and physics. Imagine you have this solution, and it's just jam-packed with all these perovskite building blocks, right? Well, to actually form those crystals, they need the perfect conditions, the right temperature, the right concentration. Think of it like throwing a party. You need the right mix of people and that perfect atmosphere to get things really going.
So it's about setting the stage for those perovskite molecules to, like, mingle and get organized, right?
Exactly. And scientists use these models, like the Lemare model, to try to understand how those tiny crystals, the nuclei, form and then start to grow. It's all about finding that sweet spot where the molecules have enough energy to move around and bump into each other, but not so much energy that they just stay dissolved.
So it's like finding that perfect tempo on the perovskite dance floor, huh? Not too slow, not too fast.
That's a great way to put it. And things get even more interesting when we're talking about 2D perovskites. Because unlike those 3D perovskites, those 2D crystals, they actually like to start forming at the surface of the solution. Kind of like when you see a layer of frost forming on a window pane.
So they're building their, like, crystal cities from the top down.
Yeah.
That seems counterintuitive.
It does, but it's actually a key characteristic of how those 2D perovskites crystallize. And it often leads to that normal gradient phase distribution we were talking about before, with more 3D-like perovskites at the top and more 2D-like ones at the bottom.
Ah, so that's how they get that parfait-like structure. It seems super complex, but I'm guessing researchers have some, like, secret weapons to control all of this, right?
Oh, absolutely. And that's where something called precursor ink engineering comes into the picture. It's all about like fine-tuning the recipe for that perovskite solution to really dial in those specific properties they're looking for. A big part of that is something we call solvent engineering.
Ah, yes. Solvents. I remember from our other deep dives that, solvents, they're like those unsung heroes of chemistry. Picking the right one can make or break the whole thing.
No doubt. And when it comes to making these 2D perovskites, the solvent isn't just some like passive ingredient. It plays a huge role in how those crystals form. Things like polarity, the boiling point of the solvent, even how well it interacts with the perovskite molecules, all of that can have a huge impact on what that final film looks like.
It's like they have to find the perfect dance partner for those perovskite molecules.
You got it. A lot of the time, researchers use solvents like DMF and DMSO, but they're always experimenting, always trying new combinations. Sometimes they even use like 3 different solvents together.
Wow. Perovskite cocktail. But solvents aren't the whole story, are they? There's got to be more to this ink engineering magic.
Oh, there's definitely more. Scientists also add these special ingredients, what we call additives, to that precursor solution. And these additives can act like little helpers, influencing the crystallization in all sorts of interesting ways.
Okay, now this is where my chemistry knowledge starts to get a little shaky. What kind of, like, magic potions are they adding to the mix?
So one pretty common additive is chloride salts. These guys can actually slow down that crystallization process, giving those perovskite molecules more time to find their perfect spot and create this more ordered, more stable structure. It's like they're calming things down a bit, making sure that perovskite party doesn't get too wild too fast.
So a more chill and organized crystallization environment. Makes sense. What else?
Well, then you have thiocyanate salts, and these guys can actually do the opposite. They can promote a vertical crystal orientation, which, remember, is what we want, those nice column-like structures.
Those, like the perovskite traffic cops, making sure those electrons are all heading in the right direction.
Yeah.
I'm amazed by how much control they have over this.
It really is impressive. And researchers are always finding, new and exciting additives like ionic liquids. These guys can actually help to what we call passivate defects, those little imperfections in the crystal structure that can mess with how well the material performs.
So, like a team of tiny perovskite repair crews patching up any cracks or potholes on those electron highways.
I like that analogy. That's perfect. And all of this careful precursor ink engineering, it sets the stage for that final step, actually processing that solution into a thin film.
Right. Okay, let's talk about those processing techniques. I think I remember from some of our past deep dives that spin coating is a pretty popular method.
Yeah, you're right. Spin coating is like the workhorse in perovskite fabrication. Basically, you drop a little bit of that precursor solution onto a spinning substrate, and the centrifugal force spreads it out into this nice, thin, uniform film, kind of like, when a potter shapes clay on a spinning wheel.
A perovskite merry-go-round. That's a great visual. But even within spin coating, there are different techniques, right? Like, what tricks do researchers use to fine-tune the process?
Oh, yeah, they've got a whole bag of tricks. One popular one is what we call hot casting, where they heat up the substrate before they do the spin coating, and that helps the solvent evaporate faster, leading to faster crystallization.
Okay, so it's all about creating the ideal temperature and timing for that perovskite party to really get going.
Exactly. And then there's this other method called the anti-solvent method, which, the name might sound a little weird, but it's really effective. What they do is, while the substrate is spinning, they very carefully drip in a second solvent, one that the perovskite doesn't really like to dissolve in.
So it's like they're suddenly changing the vibe at that perovskite party, forcing them to pair up and crystallize really quickly.
Yeah, that's a great way to think about it. This rapid precipitation, it can actually lead to smoother, more compact films. It's all about, controlling how quickly those crystals form and how uniformly they're distributed.
Wow. Incredible. We're not quite done yet, though, are we? There's more to this perovskite filmmaking process.
There is, there is. After the spin coating, there's this really important step called post-annealing. Basically, you heat up the film in this really controlled environment, and that helps get rid of any leftover solvent and make sure that crystallization is complete. Think of it like baking a cake. You got to make sure it's fully cooked and has that perfect texture.
So a little spa treatment for those perovskite crystals, helping them relax and reach their full potential. I'm sensing a theme here, though. It's all about precision, control at every stage.
Absolutely, you're spot on. Scientists are super meticulous about all the details. The solvents, the additives, the spin speed, the annealing temperature, all of it matters. And it's this attention to detail, this really careful control over every step that lets them create these really amazing 2D perovskite thin films with all those specific properties they're aiming for.
This has been a whirlwind, honestly. So much to learn. Before we move on, though, can we maybe circle back to those mixed 2D, 3D perovskites we talked about earlier? They sound like, the ultimate hybrid, combining all the best qualities of both. How do researchers go about creating these mixed systems?
It's like assembling a team of superheroes. We've got two main approaches: in-situ growth and then using those 2D spacers as like passivation layers.
Okay, so a two-pronged attack. Let's unpack those a bit. What does in-situ growth actually entail?
All right, picture this. You're baking a cake, right? And you decide, hey, I want to add some chocolate chips to the batter. In-situ growth is kind of like that. You're taking those 2D spacers, or even just like pure 2D perovskites, and adding them directly into that 3D perovskite precursor solution. So as those crystals are forming, those 2D components, they get like incorporated right into that 3D structure.
So you're basically blending those 2D and 3D perovskite building blocks together at like a molecular level. That's pretty cool. But what's the advantage? Why go through all that trouble?
The idea is that those 2D components, they can act like, these little reinforcing agents. They improve the stability of the whole structure and reduce strain within that 3D perovskite lattice. Like, imagine adding rebar to concrete, makes it stronger.
Right, right. So it's all about building a tougher, more resilient 3D perovskite. Are there any specific examples of how researchers are actually doing this?
Oh, there are some really cool examples. For instance, there's this spacer called PYBA. It's got these interesting interactions, and they can actually help guide that crystallization process. And what they've found is that just adding a little bit of PYBA, it leads to bigger, more uniform 3D perovskite crystals with fewer of those pesky defects.
Wow. So those PYBA spacers are like little architects, helping to build a better perovskite structure.
Exactly. It's amazing. And then there's another really cool example using 1-adinium.Ga for short. If you incorporate just a tiny amount of Ga, it can create these ridiculously long electron diffusion lengths.
Wait, hold on. Remind me what those are again.
Oh, right. Sorry. So electron diffusion length is basically how far those electrons can travel within the material before they, recombine and lose their energy. So longer diffusion lengths are a good thing, means less energy loss.
Ah, okay. Gotcha. So those energized electrons, they can travel further and reach those electrodes and, actually contribute to generating electricity.
You got it. Longer diffusion lengths mean more efficient energy conversion.
Cool. So in-situ growth is all about mixing those 2D and 3D components during the crystallization process.
Yeah.
What about that other approach, though? Using the 2D spacers as passivation layers. How's that work?
Think of it like adding a protective coating, like a shield, to that 3D perovskite. You're essentially wrapping it up in a layer of that 2D perovskite, which can dramatically increase its stability. And sometimes it can even boost its performance, too.
So shielding that delicate 3D perovskite from the elements, huh? How do they figure out which 2D spacer to use for that protective layer, though?
That's a great question. It's all about the chemistry. The solvent they use for the 2D spacer, it's super important. They found that certain solvents, like acetonitrile, can dissolve those 2D perovskites without messing up the 3D layer underneath. It's kind of like finding a cleaning solution that can remove dirt without damaging the surface you're cleaning. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah, I get it. So making sure those 2D and 3D perovskites play nicely together, compatibility is key.
Absolutely. And once they have that perfect solvent, they can apply that 2D spacer layer to either the top surface of the 3D perovskite, the bottom surface, or in some cases, even both.
Double the protection, why not? But does it matter which side they put it on? Top versus bottom?
It can. Putting it on the top is like, sealing up those cracks in the roof we talked about. Keeps that moisture and oxygen from getting in. But applying it to the bottom surface, where the 3D perovskite meets the electrode, that can actually make charge extraction a lot easier. Helps those electrons flow out more efficiently and generate more electricity.
So like giving those electrons a nice smooth on-ramp to the highway.
Exactly. It's all about optimization. And researchers are constantly, experimenting with different spacer options and different ways to deposit those passivation layers, trying to find that perfect combination for each specific application.
So I have to ask, with all these different approaches, all these spacer options, all this complexity, how do they even begin to figure out which one's the best? Is there like a clear winner in the perovskite race?
That's the million-dollar question. And honestly, there isn't really a one-size-fits-all answer. The best approach really depends on what you're trying to achieve, what specific properties you need for that solar cell.
So it's about finding the right tool for the job, huh? Like a carpenter choosing different saws for different cuts.
Yep, exactly. And that's why, scientists are so focused on really understanding the fundamentals of these mixed systems. They're using all sorts of fancy characterization techniques to really dig deep and see what's happening at that nanoscale level. How those charges are moving, how they're recombining, all that good stuff.
It's like they have these like super-powered microscopes that let them see those electrons dancing around within the perovskite structure.
It's pretty wild. And with every experiment, they're getting closer and closer to unlocking the full potential of these mixed 2D, 3D perovskites.
It's been quite a journey. This deep dive has taken us through the world of perovskite solar cells, from those finicky 3D structures to the much more robust 2D versions, and now these like super exciting mixed systems. It seems like scientists are making incredible progress.
They really are. It's amazing to see how far this field has come in such a short amount of time.
Let's take a moment to step back though. Think about what this all means for the future of solar energy. The bigger picture, our transition to a more sustainable world.
That's the ultimate goal, right? To harness that power of the sun and meet our energy needs cleanly and sustainably. And these perovskite solar cells, particularly these 2D and mixed systems, I think they have a real shot at playing a major role in that.
So we're talking about a future where solar panels aren't just, like this niche technology, but a real mainstream energy source.
Imagine like homes, businesses, even entire cities, all powered by these efficient, durable, and affordable perovskite solar cells. That's the vision driving all of this research.
Just really compelling vision, a cleaner, greener world. Pretty inspiring.
And I think it's becoming more attainable every day, thanks to all those amazing scientists all over the world who are really pushing the limits of what's possible with this incredible technology.
This whole deep dive has been so informative. I'm walking away with like this renewed sense of optimism, about the future of solar energy. It's really incredible what they're doing.
I agree. It's definitely an exciting time to be following this field.
Before we sign off, though, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought. The thing about scientific discovery, it's that it never really ends. There are always more questions to ask, more challenges to tackle, more frontiers to explore.
Yeah, that's what makes it so exciting. Science is a constant journey of exploration and innovation.
And on that note, I think it's time to bring our deep dive into the world of 2D perovskites to a close. Thanks for joining us on this incredible adventure, and we hope you've learned something new along the way. Until next time, keep exploring.